Remember when James Bond hurled himself off a dam, drove a tank through St. Petersburg, and made a satellite weapon feel personal? Pierce Brosnan, Judi Dench, Famke Janssen, and a 6-year legal war. Today we're counting down 15 weird facts you never knew about GoldenEye. Number 15. The opening of GoldenEye tells you immediately what kind of film you are in for. A figure in black drops off a massive dam in Switzerland and plunges toward the gorge below. It looks spectacular. It looks like a visual effect. It was completely real. Stuntman Wayne Michaels performed the jump off Switzerland's Verzaska Dam for real, setting a Guinness World Record for the highest bungee jump from a structure in a film. The drop measured 220 meters, just over 720 feet. Second unit director Simon Crane recruited Michaels, and 6 cameras captured the jump. The concave shape of the dam created a dangerous wind vortex, and Michaels had to hold a perfect swallow dive while drawing a pistol mid-fall to avoid the dam's protruding struts. Director Martin Campbell wanted his opening image of the new Bond to be raw and fearless. Per the DVD commentary, Michaels completed the jump essentially in a single take. A 2002 Sky Movies poll voted it the best movie stunt of all time. The thing that launched Brosnan's Bond era was performed in real freefall by a man dropping the height of 2 Eiffel Tower halves. Next time you watch, the cut from the falling figure to Brosnan's face is a seamless stuntman to actor handoff shot at Pinewood. Something else was returning after a long absence too, and it had been gone for 30 years. Number 14. The scene is immediately familiar. A silver Aston Martin DB5 winds through mountain hairpin bends above Monte Carlo, racing a red Ferrari F355. It feels like classic Bond. It also had not happened since Sean Connery was in the tux, because this was the first time 007 had driven a DB5 since Thunderball in 1965. 3 DB5s were used in production, and this one carried no weapons. The choice was deliberate. Producers equipped it with a champagne cooler in the armrest and a fax and printer, gadget-free by design. The signal to audiences was clear. This is the same Bond you loved, updated rather than replaced. Veteran stunt coordinator Army Julian handled the mountain chase, working to make a 30-year-old British classic look evenly matched against a modern Ferrari. He later admitted being somewhat distracted by Famke Janssen's expression through the windscreen on one of the hairpin bends. Pierce Brosnan later admitted in interviews that he drove much of the chase himself, including the embarrassing detail that he had the handbrake partially applied for most of it. The DB5 was a heritage statement wrapped in aluminum and wire wheels. It told audiences that GoldenEye was in conversation with 5 decades of Bond history, not starting over. A new Bond needed a new boss, though, and that casting decision broke a 33-year tradition that nobody had imagined breaking. Number 13. The scene stops the film cold. A new M sits behind the desk, and the first thing she does is dismantle Bond with surgical precision. A sexist, misogynist dinosaur, a relic of the Cold War, she tells him, and means it. Judi Dench became the first woman to play M in the history of the Bond franchise, and the choice was rooted in the real world. The casting is widely reported as inspired by Stella Remington, who in 1992 became the first publicly named head of MI5. Dench herself has denied basing her performance directly on Remington, but the cultural context was unavoidable. Screenwriter Bruce Feirstein wrote multiple drafts of the M confrontation scene, but according to The Hollywood Reporter, the version that made it to screen was the first one filmed. Director Martin Campbell shaped the scene specifically to address what audiences were already thinking about the franchise's place in the post-Cold War world. What nobody fully anticipated was how completely Dench would own the role. She stayed for 8 consecutive films, all the way through Spectre in 2015, spanning 2 Bonds and 2 entirely different franchise tones. On the first day of filming, Dench reportedly said she did not know which of them was more nervous, her or Brosnan. Watching that confrontation scene now, it is almost impossible to believe there was any uncertainty. While the film rethought its leadership, a small game studio in England was quietly building GoldenEye's most enduring legacy. Number 12. Most people who lived through the late 1990s remember GoldenEye 007 on the Nintendo 64 as vividly as they remember the film itself, possibly more. But the game that became one of the most influential first-person shooters ever made very nearly arrived as something completely different, a two-dimensional side-scroller for the Super Nintendo. Developer Rare initially proposed a 2D platform game before director Martin Hollis pitched a three-dimensional first-person shooter for the not-yet-released N64. The team was mostly inexperienced with game development at that scale. Production began in January 1995 and ran for roughly 2.5 years, releasing in August 1997. Long after the film had already come and gone from cinemas, Hollis and artist Carl Hilton visited the Leavesden film set to photograph real props and environments for reference. The 4-player split-screen multiplayer mode, the thing that made the game legendary, was, according to developer David Doak speaking to Retro Gamer in 2004, a complete afterthought. Steve Ellis built most of it essentially alone, taking a finished single-player game and quietly converting it into a multiplayer experience. The result sold 8.09 million units worldwide, making it the third best-selling N64 game of all time, behind Super Mario 64 and Mario Kart 64, per Guinness World Records. GoldenEye on N64 became its own cultural reference, independent of the film. That comeback almost never happened at all, though, because Bond had spent years trapped in a lawsuit. Number 11. After License to Kill in 1989, the James Bond franchise simply disappeared. Not from lack of interest, not from audience fatigue, but from a legal war that locked the entire property in place for years. After the Bond franchise changed corporate hands and new MGM owner Giancarlo Peretti attempted to sell off Bond television and home video rights at cut-rate prices, holding company Danjaq filed suit. The litigation dragged on for years, settling around December 1992. By that point, so much time had passed that Timothy Dalton's contract had lapsed. In April 1994, Dalton resigned publicly, telling reporters it was time to leave the role behind. A third Dalton film had been scripted. There had even been a Cannes billboard. It simply never happened. Albert Cubby Broccoli, who had produced Bond since 1962, was in declining health throughout the delay. His daughter Barbara Broccoli stepped into a leadership role while the franchise waited. The Cold War ended during the hiatus. The Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union dissolved. The entire geopolitical context that had defined Bond for 3 decades was gone by the time filming could begin. The 6-year gap was the longest in Bond history and left genuine uncertainty about whether the franchise could survive. When production finally moved forward, they faced an immediate practical problem. There was not a studio big enough to shoot what they needed. Number 10. The tank chase through St. Petersburg is one of the great action sequences in the Bond series. Brosnan mowing through fountains, statues, and civilian property in a Soviet-era T-55 tank, the city crumbling behind him. Here is the thing about all of that glorious destruction. Practically none of it was filmed in Russia. With Pinewood Studios occupied by the production of First Night, production designer Peter Lamont converted a derelict Rolls-Royce aircraft factory at Leavesden into a film studio from scratch. It was the Bond franchise's first production there. Lamont and his team built a 2-block St. Petersburg streetscape on the old airfield in approximately 6 to 7 weeks, held together by 62 miles of scaffolding. Second unit teams did travel to the real St. Petersburg for establishing shots and inserts, which were cut together with Brosnan's Leavesden work. Brosnan himself never went to Russia. Director Martin Campbell has said MGM provided a budget of around $55 million, and the production team considered it insufficient. The gap between what the script called for and what the money covered was bridged almost entirely by practical ingenuity and miniature effects supervised by Chris Corbould and Ian Sharp. Russian news channels reportedly ran critical segments about the destruction of our heritage, without realizing that the statues being crushed were fiberglass and plaster replicas built in a British factory. One real piece of military hardware that appeared in the film, however, came with strings attached from two governments. Number 9. Xenia Onatop arrives in Monaco in a sleek, cutting-edge helicopter, a prototype so advanced it practically drives the early plot. The French Navy agreed to loan the production a real prototype Eurocopter Tiger, along with its stealth frigate Lafayette, years before either had entered active service. It was an extraordinary piece of hardware to have in a movie. It came with conditions. The U.S. Department of Defense, through its Hollywood liaison Phil Strub, had objections to the script as originally written. An American admiral was killed and comprehensively outwitted during the sequence. Strub's office found that depiction unacceptable. The production changed the admiral's nationality to Canadian in order to preserve the cooperation that gave them military assets for the finale. That is not a minor thing. Real government departments were reshaping the narrative of a spy film. Pierce Brosnan had his own political objection. He boycotted the Paris premiere entirely to protest France's nuclear testing in the South Pacific, leading to the cancellation of the premiere event. It was a rare case of a lead actor taking a public stand against the country whose military hardware had just made his movie. The Eurocopter Tiger went on to actual military service. The film functioned as its marketing launch. There is something quietly extraordinary about a Bond villain using hardware that was not yet available to any army. The biggest casting story of the film, though, had its roots 9 years in the past. Number 8. Watching Pierce Brosnan as Bond in 1995 carries a weight that most casual viewers do not realize. He had been there before, or almost there. In 1986, Brosnan was set to replace Roger Moore and become the next James Bond. Producers had made their choice. The announcement was essentially ready. Then NBC revived his canceled television series Remington Steele purely to capitalize on the Bond publicity, and his contract prevented him from taking the role. It went to Timothy Dalton instead. 8 years later, when producers were searching for a new Bond, they went back to Brosnan. But the search was not simple. Before he was confirmed, Mel Gibson passed. Liam Neeson passed. Paul McGann was reportedly the second choice. Ralph Fiennes, who would later become M in the Craig era, met with producers. Director Martin Campbell himself got the job through an unusual path. A United Artists executive had seen his low-budget 1994 film No Escape. Campbell has joked that he was partly hired because he was affordable. Before him, director John Woo was offered GoldenEye and turned it down. Brosnan told journalists before the film's release, "I wasn't meant to do it then. I was meant to do it now." The 1986 set prologue of GoldenEye is set exactly in the year Brosnan was originally supposed to debut as Bond. Even the opening is haunted by the role he almost had. The theme song nearly collapsed just as badly. All right. We're at the halfway mark, and things are about to get even wilder. Before we hit the top 7, I want to hear from you. What's your favorite GoldenEye quote or moment? Drop it in the comments. And if you're enjoying this, smash that like button and subscribe. It helps the channel grow. Number 7. GoldenEye is one of the most memorable Bond themes in the series. Tina Turner's voice riding an orchestral swell with authority and real cool. It sounds inevitable now. Behind the scenes, it nearly collapsed before a single note was recorded. The song was written by U2's Bono and The Edge. The demo they sent to Turner was rough to the point of unusable. Turner told BBC Radio 2's Graham Norton show in 2018, "Bono sent me the worst demo. He kind of threw it together as if he thought I wasn't going to do it. This song, I didn't even know what key to practice it in." Bono later acknowledged the demo was really, really bad. Turner almost walked away entirely. She was not the only artist in the conversation. Depeche Mode were approached first and declined amid scheduling conflicts. Swedish pop group Ace of Base recorded their own Bond theme concept that was rejected, later reworked and released as The Juvenile. Legendary Bond composer John Barry was offered the main score by Barbara Broccoli, but turned it down. Bono reportedly insisted no other songwriter would write the theme. Because Bono and composer Eric Serra never collaborated, Turner's melody appears nowhere in the film itself. The opening titles and the movie are musically disconnected from each other. The composer was about to have a much bigger confrontation over his music. Number 6. Eric Serra was an inspired choice on paper. He had just scored Leon, The Professional, bringing a modern electronic sensibility to action cinema. Barbara Broccoli brought him aboard to update Bond's sonic identity, push the sound away from the familiar orchestral template, and take creative risks. Some of those risks did not land. Serra's cue for the St. Petersburg tank chase was the most contested piece of music in the production. When the sequence was locked and his score played against it, the feedback from producers and the director was stark. It did not work. The track was rejected, and a replacement was commissioned from composer John Altman. Serra's original tank chase cue did not disappear entirely. It survives on the official soundtrack album under the title A Pleasant Drive in St. Petersburg. Listeners can compare the two versions and judge for themselves which one fits the sequence. Director Martin Campbell later expressed dissatisfaction with the overall score, citing creative difficulties and budget pressures, noting that Serra became increasingly difficult to work with after the rejection. Serra's fingerprints are still on the film in other ways. He performed the end credits song himself and sang the James Bond theme arrangement in the gun barrel opener. The score remains the most divisive in the franchise, a deliberate modernization gamble that worked in some places and strained in others. The film's most outrageous performance was an equally high-wire act behind the scenes. Number 5. Xenia Onatopp is one of the great Bond villains for reasons that go well beyond the role's obvious eccentricity. Famke Janssen brought a genuine physical ferocity to a character designed to exist in the overlap between parody and menace. Director Martin Campbell described her approach bluntly. She has an orgasm every time she kills someone. That physical commitment came at a cost. For the sauna fight sequence, Campbell had the set lined with rubber padding to limit injuries. Janssen still hurt her back during filming, according to Campbell's recollections from the production. The choreography required her to be repeatedly slammed against surfaces while maintaining the character's ecstatic expression throughout. Stunt coordinator Remy Julien handled the most dangerous driving maneuvers in the Monte Carlo chase, though Janssen has said in television interviews that she performed some of the driving herself. Lead actress Isabella Scorupco, who plays Natalia, was cast in something approaching a last-minute scramble. A Swedish casting director located her just days before filming began, according to casting director Debbie McWilliams, after a wider search had not produced the right fit. Janssen's performance launched her Hollywood career in a way few villain roles do. Xenia became one of the most referenced and parodied Bond henchpeople in the franchise's history, which is a considerable achievement in a series that has produced decades of memorable antagonists. The script that gave her that character, though, involved a writing process so contentious that one of the original writers still feels shortchanged. Number 4. GoldenEye has 4 credited and uncredited writers attached to it, which is not unusual for a large franchise film but is worth understanding, because the person who wrote the first draft feels the final credit did not reflect the work. Michael France, a former Bond Fan magazine editor, wrote the original screenplay. He was then followed by Jeffrey Kane, who did a substantial rewrite. Uncredited work was contributed by Kevin Wade, and Bruce Firestein completed the final polish. France ended up with a story by credit, which he publicly called unfair, arguing that the changes made to his draft were not improvements. Barbara Broccoli felt France's original script was too relentlessly action-focused. France himself described the problem: every 10 minutes you had a $20 million sequence. Kane's rewrite added the pre-titles prologue and reshaped the villain as Bond's direct equal and former partner, which gave the story its emotional spine. Kevin Wade was honored quietly. CIA contact Jack Wade in the film was named after him. In a notable historical footnote, France's draft predated James Cameron's True Lies by years, disproving any suggestion that GoldenEye borrowed from Cameron's film. France's original villain was named Augustus Trevelyan, slightly different from the film's Alec Trevelyan. The finished script is a layered collaboration under a single story credit. One late addition to that story changed the most iconic thing about Bond. Number 3. For the first time in franchise history, James Bond's primary vehicle was not British. the BMW Z3 Roadster, introduced in Q's lab and dispatched with a list of gadgets that sound genuinely dangerous, was a landmark product placement deal that predated the car's commercial release by months. BMW sold a limited Neiman Marcus 007 edition run that reportedly sold out quickly, and the placement is still cited as one of the most strategically successful automotive tie-ins in blockbuster history. Here is what makes it strange. None of the gadgets Q describes are used in the film. According to director Martin Campbell, the BMW deal was finalized so late in production that there was no time to build the gadgets or write them into the action. Q promises Stinger missiles and a self-destruct mechanism. The Z3 appears in one sequence and then vanishes from the story entirely. Desmond Llewellyn, returning as Q, got one of his finest moments from the scene regardless. His line, "Oh, grow up 007," landed perfectly. He also got a genuine surprise on the day. A crew member was suddenly ejected from a chair by a prop mechanism that nobody had warned Llewellyn about. He later recalled, "I had a hell of a shock." Pure Llewellyn. The BMW deal signaled a new era in franchise financing and blockbuster marketing logic. The finale, meanwhile, brought two old friends into a very real fight with real injuries. Number 2. The climax of GoldenEye takes place at a vast satellite dish installation in Cuba, and Bond and Trevelyan battle across it in one of the franchise's most brutally personal fights. The dish is the real Arecibo Observatory in Puerto Rico. United States travel and commercial restrictions made filming in Cuba impossible, so the production found the closest equivalent in American-administered territory. Director Martin Campbell modeled the climactic fight consciously on the iconic train brawl between Bond and Red Grant in From Russia with Love. He wanted the same intimate, vicious quality, two men who know each other, with genuine history between them. Pierce Brosnan and Sean Bean performed nearly all of the fight themselves. A body double was used for only one throw. Brosnan injured his hand during the extending ladder sequence, forcing the production team to reshuffle the shooting schedule and move the Severnaya scenes forward to accommodate the injury. Special effects designer Derek Meddings achieved the film's large-scale destruction, including the lake drain and the dish collapse, entirely through miniature work. GoldenEye was his final film. He died in 1995 before its release. The fight works because it is personal in a way Bond climaxes rarely are. Trevelyan is not a random megalomaniac, he is Bond's mirror image, which is why Campbell borrowed his staging from the series' greatest one-on-one confrontation. Everything about the film had to work, though, because nothing less than the franchise itself was riding on the answer. Number 1. By the time GoldenEye opened in November 1995, the pressure on it was unlike almost anything in franchise history. Bond had been absent for 6 years. The Cold War context that had defined the character was gone. A new Bond had been introduced after years of legal deadlock. The question was not whether GoldenEye would be a good film. The question was whether James Bond still meant anything to audiences. The answer came quickly and clearly. GoldenEye grossed $356.4 million worldwide on a $60 million budget, with $106.4 million domestic and $250 million international. It was the highest-grossing Bond film since Moonraker. In the U.S., it opened at number 1 across 2,667 theaters, earning $26.2 million in its opening weekend. In the UK, it set a record, grossing $5.5 million from 448 theaters in a non-holiday week. The third largest British opening in history, at that point behind Jurassic Park and Batman Forever. Pierce Brosnan, who had been denied the role in 1986, had vindicated the long wait. Producer Albert Cubby Broccoli, who had shepherded the franchise since 1962, died 7 months after the film's release, with GoldenEye as his final production credit. His daughter Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson carried the franchise forward. The success meant 3 more Brosnan films, and it made Martin Campbell the director Eon trusted to launch Daniel Craig in Casino Royale 11 years later. Knowing what GoldenEye had to prove, every set piece in it hits differently. GoldenEye arrived carrying 6 years of legal battles, franchise doubt, a budget that did not match the ambition, a composer feud, a theme song nearly abandoned, and a leading man denied the role almost a decade earlier. Every one of those pressures found its way into the film, and somehow every single one made it stronger. The dam jump was real. The city was fake. The fight was deeply personal. The gamble paid off in every way that mattered. If this video surprised you, drop your favorite fact in the comments. Like, subscribe, and share this with someone who loves this movie as much as you do. And as always, the firing squad is rather frowned upon these days. We'll see you next time.